Encounters is a purely documentary festival, so we just focus on the documentary genre, and at its core is to increase the currency of documentary in the region and in South Africa in particular, to give local filmmakers the opportunity to show their films, right, as well as to watch international films. The criteria for selection varies every year, right? It depends on what the focus is going to be, or what stories are coming out in their numbers. So the submissions, the type of stories. So sometimes the focus is created based on the submissions, right? Other times there's a focus already set and find the films. There's two ways. There's a selection panel that sifts through all the submissions and then will give me a short list of films to watch, and from there I program out of that. And then there's the other side of it. With some of the international films, we try and get big films, big documentaries, right? About between 5 to 7 big documentaries. So there's the Oscar winners, films that won at Sundance, in that vein, you know. So we try and get the big films at the festival as well. But our main focus is on documentary as a form of art, right? So we're not necessarily focused on human rights or focused on gender issues, but some years we'll have a focus. So this year we had a focus on women directors, for instance, within the festival, right? So even though the rest of the films are on the art of documentary, we had a special section that just looked at the films that came out in the last year from women directors. I think identity plays a large role, because you see a lot of films on identity and a lot of films on the socio-economic life of living on the African continent, you know. So that's still very strong as a topic that comes out. But again, it varies from year to year, you know, but it's essentially like very localized, real life. This is what it is to live on the African continent. This is how the society interfaces with politicians, you know, so it's still quite rooted in the politics. In South Africa, we're still working on kind of navigating what freedom means, you know, which I can only liken to probably young Eastern Europeans as well. Like, what does it mean to live 21 years after the fall of communism? You know, so we're still there in terms of kind of focusing on what it is, what our national identity is, and what it actually means to be African in the modern world. I think every year you get better quality films, right? And that, I think, speaks to the access that filmmakers have through digital technology. So the access that they have to equipment, you know, you don't need as much money to make a film as you did maybe 20 years ago. Right? And more young filmmakers are playing around with the genre and playing around with transmedia. So not just for broadcast, but with stuff you can find on the internet, you know? So the quality is growing, not necessarily at a rapid pace, you know, but as filmmakers develop their bodies of work, you can actually see the growth. South Africa still is one of the few African countries that has support from government, right? So we're fortunate as people on the African continent. We have the Department of Arts and Culture, we have the National Film and Video Foundation, who are very supportive of the arts, right? But it's never really enough, you know, because there's only so much that they can give. So for every 100 proposals, you'd maybe get funding, maybe 7 of them will get funding out of a cycle, right? That doesn't necessarily make an industry. So a lot of filmmakers rely on international funding bodies that give money to African films. But we're also caught in the global crisis, as it were, where funding for the arts is being chopped and one is having to find other avenues, right? So I think the conversations now are also around like building an industry that also can be commercially viable. In the absence of broadcasters, because with documentary films, it's, you know, you can show them in festivals, yes, but
like everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. But you need to have broadcaster that cares enough about the genre to do something about it. With documentary films, when you don't have a broadcaster right, that will license the films, it becomes very difficult for filmmakers to, to function or to earn a living out of it. In South Africa, it's unfortunate that our local broadcaster kind of just disintegrated, right? So that doesn't even exist as an option for filmmakers. But what's great is that you have broadcasters like Al Jazeera that commission a large portion of African content. In fact, I think they're the largest broadcaster, international broadcaster that commissions African content, right? And they have programs like Al Jazeera Viewfinder Asia, Al Jazeera Viewfinder South America, so they do a lot in the global south. So having those are an option, but it's tricky when you don't have broadcasters in your own country that understand that, because then you also have filmmakers that go outside, which then speaks to who owns the rights to the films. You're telling your own stories, but you don't own them, as it were. The current networks of documentaries, I find them to be somewhat insular, right? And the festival circuit, whilst it's a great circuit, you pretty much like see similar people, or it's a small community of people, right? So what's more of interest to me is building networks that like cross continental borders. That's more interesting. So like, you mentioned that you're a filmmaker, and if you have a network with the South African filmmaker, that for me is more of a network that makes sense, because we're all existing in the world in a particular way. And as documentary filmmakers and practitioners, that should be of primary importance, So the networks are there, they're good, but I think they need to be more inclusive, more accessible, and just more open. Because right now, and it might be a limited opinion, it seems like they're little like mafia, little mafia pockets that are difficult for young filmmakers to penetrate. What's interesting for me, it's my first time in Romania, right? And what's interesting for me is seeing the similarities of the kinds of stories that are being told. So you're not saying that people are dealing with identity and, kind of the texture of what freedom means, is a lot of what I've seen here coming out of young filmmakers, like different variations of what it is to live under a system or a new system rather, right? So with the first generation of people that are able to function in systems in both countries that our parents didn't have when they were growing up, and it's those kinds of stories that I get. The Astra Film Festival, I really love what it's doing in bringing people from around the world and actually exposing Romanians to what's happening outside of the world, and also exposing the rest of us to what's happening inside of the world. And that's what's fantastic about festivals, because otherwise you would never really have the opportunity to situate yourself and contextualize what's happening and to break the barrier of cultural prejudice. So far, I've been on the jury, so I've been kind of locked in rooms and films, so I haven't really gotten a sense of CVU yet. But so far, so good. The quality is quite impressive. It's really, really impressive, like how the stories are told, how the camera is used as a tool to tell the story. So very interesting stuff. There seems to be somewhat of a central theme, especially with the films coming out of Central and Eastern Europe, right? And again, it has to do with that. I have a feeling like people are like, what does it mean to be here, right? What does it mean to be Eastern European, or what does it mean to be Romanian? And how do I fit in? How do my ideas fit into the current structure of the society? So it's very exciting. I'm very excited about it. And one of the main reasons I'm excited is because I see parallels.
Similarities.
Yeah, exactly. I see similarities, and it's got my mind moving on what I can do moving forward to make sure that we show those similarities, and have the filmmakers from both countries speak to each other in a particular way, even if it's just cinematically speaking to each other. So that's very exciting. Yes, I think so. I think identity in the world is also, it's important because in the last 20 to 30 years, the world has just completely shifted and changed. From technology, we don't live in the same world that our parents lived in many ways. Cell phones, the internet, political structures and ideologies, all of that. So within that, you kind of have to figure out, because our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents lived in a pretty similar world, right? So now we have to kind of work out, what does it mean to have the tools that we have, to have the access that we have.
It's opening.
And and how do we include that as part of our identity? And it's all trial and error. And anything that's trial and error is a lot of fun. So identity is important, because are you generation Y? Are you always texting? Are you always this? So we're trying to figure out where we stand, and within that, what it means, what national identity means as well. And for a lot of young people, they've got access to the world, so they're not necessarily nationalistic in the way that those that came before them are nationalistic, because of the access that they have to the world. So you're also seeing, like, how do you define yourself as a global citizen, more than how do you define yourself from a place where you come from.